Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program bringing you news, views, discussion, analysis, and up-to-date information on religious liberty in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, and I'm editor of Liberty Magazine and the host of this program. And my guest on this program is Kingsley Palmer. Welcome, Kingsley.
Thank you.
And for the viewers' information, you're a Religious Liberty Director for the Seventh Adventist Church in Arizona.
That's correct.
In the U.S.
That's right.
So let's start from that point of view. Some of our viewers may not even know, even after hearing me go on and on about religious liberty, that within our context, we combine what we call public affairs and religious liberty.
Right. That's very
Explain that. How do you see the difference or the conjunction of those two aspects?
Well, when we talk about public affairs, we're talking about having an interest in the community with respect to freedom of expression of religion and what that looks like in terms of how we, as a church, engage in the public discourse on religious liberty freedoms.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about public affairs, we're talking about engagement, we're talking about involvement, with the remit to make sure that we have a balanced view and application of how religious public affairs should work.
So public affairs, as the name says, it's public, it's outreach.
Definitely.
With the concept of religious liberty. I think it's a little bit more than that, or on a different angle. I think it intersects also with public relations for the church.
It is.
Which you would expect any group, let alone a church, to do. But I think it works very well when you combine the religious liberty emphasis with this outreach, this public relations on behalf of this particular subset of Christianity, Seventh Adventism.
Right, yes. I totally agree. And I think the prime example of that was Jesus. Okay? He was
Elaborate.
He was
in the
very
Bible,
much,
right?
Yes, in the Bible, Jesus spent most of his time engaging, building relationships, connections with people of all different shapes and sizes and different persuasions. And most of his time was spent doing that. And he really, I think, was the best example of engaging people, meeting their needs as he did, and also at the same time giving counsel, representing his Father who's in heaven, and also just sort of being out there, showing the character
I think
of
your
God.
point's well taken. Anyone that reads the Bible carefully, it will be a little troubled, as Jesus' disciples were when he made some curious statements about the non-Jews that were in contact with him. Remember, he gave the idea to the woman wanted his attention. What have I got to do with you? I've come just to the Jews. She said something to the effect that, well, even the crumbs fall off the table.
Yes, the Syrophoenician woman.
Yeah. So yes, I think that there's no question in the Bible account of Jesus, for theological reasons, he was come particularly to Israel to stir them in their ministry. But their ministry that he was encouraging them on clearly was to change the world.
Yes.
They'd forgotten it, but they were very self-contained. And so we do take a cue from Jesus that he had a concern for humanity. That was his mission, and we have to exemplify that, showing heaven's concern. So in my understanding, while we do have public relations, it should not be self-serving to promote ourselves as us as individuals or even our structure. It's what we represent. We're promoting that and explaining it rather than just doing it.
Right, we're explaining it, and like I said, it is the engagement part. It is we have to be very careful because Israel, or the Jews who Jesus was dealing with at that particular time, almost became insular. It was as though we are the special people, we have special favor, and therefore anything outside of that context.
Well, that's what I was hinting at, yeah.
Yes.
But that wasn't the design, and so God was correcting the people that have been charged with being a holy nation and a priestly nation to administer good things to the rest of the world.
Right.
and Adventism, Christianity in the largest sense, that it has no reason to be unless it's doing the same thing, reaching out and being a light, being a positive influence in the world. Now, in the modern world, we have to recognize there are Buddhists and Hindus,
Right,
and atheists of all stripes. We're not the only game in town, but still, in relating to all of those, we can fulfill the same function, can't we, of working for their good. And on religious liberty, of course, we empower them in their belief and argue on their behalf, and if necessary, suffer a consequence in our defense of their faith.
right.
But
There's risks.
very few Adventists, for example, in our own company, quite understand this.
Yes, and I think just as the people in the day when Jesus was alive had lost focus, lost their understanding of representing the character of God, which is what Jesus embodied, and touching people, meeting them where they were, irrespective. You use the example of the Syrophoenician woman, the Roman centurion, for example. Who Jesus says, listen, he says, you don't need to come to my house, just speak the word. So he was civically engaged in putting the face of God.
Romans said that because Jews wouldn't go to his house.
Well, of course they wouldn't. And that was part of the problem.
Yeah.
They had become very compartmentalized in terms of their religion and unfortunately were looked upon not very favorably by everybody else.
There was a statement made by some, I think it was a Roman historian or some public figure of that era, that no group were more distinguished by so despising the ancient gods as the Jews. Mm-hmm. Now, on one level, great. Mm-hmm. They knew the true God. But I don't think it's good psychology and ultimately good for any human being for one group to look down on what the others stand for or what they believe.
No.
And we can't afford to do that. There are real differences. And I don't know about you, but I love debating with other faiths and other viewpoints because you learn a lot from it. Plus, you sort of extract their view, and I can challenge them. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that I should, and I hope I don't, question for 1 minute their right and their sincerity in believing something that I find maybe even crazy.
Mm-hmm. Well,
you have to
when we think about, you look
that.
at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it comprises of multitudes of people coming from different economic,
how many do we have in the world now? It's something like 20 million.
20 million.
Yeah.
And that's 20 million viewpoints. That's 20 million attitudes. That's 20 million different experiences coming together under the banner of a truth. Yeah. And they bring that experience to the table. So we have to be very pragmatic. We have to be open-minded in how we approach. I think we have common beliefs as any other religious organization would have. But then those beliefs are codified in a group of policies or biblical principles that hold us together, but at the same time allows for a diversity of thought, diversity of practice.
But not just within our church.
No,
we have to allow for
outside.
Everywhere.
Outside,
yeah.
Definitely.
And I think part of allowing is to be open to dialoguing and comprehending to some degree other beliefs.
Well,
and human beings generally, I think in the modern era, are even more lacking of that than they used to be.
Mm-hmm. We have a saying in Britain, and it goes like this. Minds are like
where you grew up, right?
Where
yeah.
I grew up.
Your accent's betraying you.
Well, of course, and I'm not hiding it. Minds are like umbrellas, not much good unless they're open.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And we have to be very careful that we don't keep the umbrella closed, but we are broad in our thinking, strong in the principles that we believe in, but at the same time, you can't get to know someone unless you spend time with them.
Right.
And
well,
so,
just on something that's going on right now, since 9/11 at least,
mm-hmm.
The U.S. and I think the larger Western world particularly is suddenly trying to discover about Islam. Mm-hmm. But very seldom do I come across people that have read the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think not necessarily read and studied, but I think we should be somewhat familiar with other systems, but primarily, before we even do that, we should read our own.
Right.
When you have someone that hasn't read the Bible, hasn't read the Quran, what sort of a discussion could you have? Even with good intentions, that easily goes towards sort of polemical, partisan, backwards and forwards, and nobody's helped by it.
We've seen that. We
Right.
have seen the ostracizing. We have seen the dehumanizing, the politicizing of principles that we believe in, because we do not engage to find that other person, to listen to that person's story.
And, you know, in engagement, you might not find encouraging information from the other side, but it'll be correct. You know, a lot of the dialogue that's going on now, I think, as I said, very often from people that are not truly informed, but it's dialogue at least. It's designed to sort of create a neutral commonality. And so uncomfortable facts about beliefs or ideals of a group, religious or otherwise, are ignored, and then the commonality, and then everything's hunky-dory. But I think in religious liberty, that's not necessary. Once you have an upfront acceptance that we're all creatures of a creator God, and the US Constitution in its own pseudo-pagan way recognizes that, you know, nature and nature's God. But once you accept that, then there should be a charity toward the other person. And that charity would mean when you discover that their views are radically, not so much opposed, but radically different from yours, then that's what it is. It's not necessary that they not be radically different for you to be agreeable with them.
Right.
That's
And I think if you can find the commonalities, you know, you show a definite interest that in engaging in that person, as I said before, you want to listen to them, and you also want to learn.
Yeah.
You lose nothing by learning. You lose nothing by listening, and
Well, you gain a lot.
well, you do,
so to
and I
speak.
mean, it's got to be interactive. That's why I believe Jesus epitomizes that in terms of listening to the stories. He listened to the Syrophoenician woman. He listened to the woman at the well. He listened to the Roman centurion. He did a lot of listening, and his responses were, well, I do represent God as the Father. I am his son. I am also Jewish, but
Well, he said he
I
was
don't
the
mind.
Son of God. Most times he said he was the Son of
Son
Man.
of God. So yeah, Son of Man.
So he emphasized a common humanity.
Exactly. He built that initial connection, and he stepped out of the frame or the restrictions of what were expected of him in order to engage with human beings regardless of where they came from.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's worth remembering on Christ, the biggest attack made against him by enemies within his own people were that he was the friend and companion of sinners and publicans, in other words, drunkards and revelers, you know, the low life of society. And I think they were right. But that's not that he was one of them.
No.
But Jesus would associate with anybody that he could get close to, because he wanted to communicate, of course, the principles of heaven. But just as a human being, I think he wanted to connect.
And I also, and here's the other interesting thing, which is risky, and that's what I love about Jesus, is the fact that he was here to remind the people of his day what their true calling was, and that was to be salt. That was to permeate.
Absolutely.
That was you can't, if salt stays in a bottle, it's no use. So he did
Well,
that.
he used wonderful word pictures and imagery that
Well, of course.
communicated great spiritual truths. Stay with us. We'll be back in a short while to continue this discussion. Thank you. Welcome back from our break. And before the break, with guest Kingsley Palmer, we were getting, I was going to say philosophical, but biblical, because we were relating the role of Jesus in his earthly ministry, which is explained in the New Testament.
Right.
How he interacted with people, and applying that to the principle of religious liberty in general, and jumping off from our church's emphasis on public affairs. You know, Christianity is all to do with public affairs.
Well, Old and New
publicly
Testament.
witnessing.
When you look at the Old Testament, what was God trying to do, right? From the call of Abraham to the progression, calling him out, right? Not to stay within the confines of what he believed, but to share that with other people, all through the Old Testament. And when as we already know, that when the Hebrew nation came out of Egypt, he wanted them to be a light of the world. Even though they spent 40 years in the wilderness, the gospel had to be preached, the gospel had to be lived. God wanted to have a model group of individuals who were not perfect, but would do his will with respect to the people that...
Well, in that era, they were in the come out, the leaving phase. In the New Testament, they were in the going phase, going back.
Right. It's almost like they regressed in a sense. Yeah.
Your point is correct, but I think as a model, yes, there were problems and they were drawn out of a group, but really once they were out and distinct and had a message, then you have to go back.
Right.
And I hope our church, Seventh-day Adventist Church, as all Christian and indeed all religious groups, doesn't just keep to itself. It has to go and interact and be part of the whole.
Yeah.
There's that famous poem by, No Man is an Island.
Mm-hmm. Which we are not.
The poet. But, no man is an island. We're all part of the continent. Mm-hmm. And in the religious sense, very much so. We're part of the universe. Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds like a New Age poem. You are a part of the universe.
Well,
Rod McEwen, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, God bless him.
I'm old enough to remember that. He's gone.
God bless him. But we are part of
Desiderata,
a human. Yeah, we are part of a human family, representing a God who wants to engage. I keep on going back to that. Representing a God who wants to have a relationship with all people. The Bible says that he sends the rain and the sun on the just and the unjust.
Yeah.
And it is interesting that he calls people out of their comfort zones. If you go from Abraham all the way down to the Old Testament into the New Testament, God's always stepping out, calling people to come to him, to have a relationship with him, regardless of what their beliefs were, what their values might have been, and oftentimes in confrontation or in conflict with what he wanted. And this is why the public affairs, from we've seen it, Micah chapter 6 verse 8, listen, don't give me these sacrifices and things like that. Here's what I want you to do. Yeah. Here's what I want you to do what is right, to walk with me, right, and to engage other people, and particularly when we're strangers.
What did he say? What does the Lord require of you?
To
do justice,
love mercy.
And love mercy and walk with all men.
Exactly.
All men.
And so that is what we're supposed to do. It's interesting that with the Ten Commandments, if I can just dwell on that for a minute, the first 4 of those commandments have to do with God's relationship, our relationship and responsibility to God. The last 6 focuses on the engagement piece. How do you live with each other? How do you treat people? Yeah. And Adventists, you know how it is. We get up in church and it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and we go on, and then 6 days shalt thou labor. And then it ends, thou nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy ox, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger. That is within that gate. And
we could have a whole program on that.
On that one point alone, yes.
Because that is very good instruction to a nation that was ruled as a theocracy. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you can apply that in the modern world with the truest principle of religious liberty. If I have a stranger within my gate and he's not a Christian even, mm-hmm. I can't easily require him to keep my day.
No.
Or my religion.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the way application I would have is we have an obligation to tell them why this is now a holy day. They're not to be ignored, they're to be included if they're willing.
Right, and it's always choice.
To quote the Quran, which other times seems to deny itself, the Quran says no compulsion in religion, and that's truly a biblical principle too. It's
kind of interesting that you mentioned the Quran. Sometimes we as Christians have got to a place where our interpretation or understanding of what we do as a faith-keeping, God-serving group of people, we can be compartmentalized on the one hand. In other words, if you're within my gate, just to use the expression, it means that I should demonstrate by how I behave and how I live the positive elements of what I believe in reflection of God. But we can tend to, if we're not very careful, become so closed-minded and even judgmental to the point where we ostracize people who are not of the same belief system. We saw that with the Spanish Inquisition. We've seen Christianity hasn't always been clean and open-minded and objective as it should.
You know, I would broaden it. Since religion is such an important thing for people, particularly you're getting it more into the modern era, religion is used to create walls to separate one group from another. And at times of stress, since you can easily put the other group as evil or something rather sinister, then there can be even violence. But it's not unique to Christianity. At the moment, we're seeing more of this phenomenon, I think, with Islamic communities. And you know, a lot of people try to dodge it. It's real, but of course it can happen with any group. And in India, and I know you worked in India for a while, you know, Hindu nationalists are indulging in a lot of violence that I don't think is defensible, but it is explainable. They're feeling threatened, and the sense of the religious and political other is so overwhelming that they lash out. So, you know, dialogue between faith groups, I think, is profitable, not to explain away the differences. It might even sharpen them, but it will humanize the communities and create a bridge and a dialogue back to the public affairs aspect that we're talking about.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because what public affairs does, and I'll give you an example, as a pastor, whichever community you go into, you're going to see a variation of different belief systems, different churches, mosques, what have you. The thing is, if you have an open mind, I go back to the umbrella, you know, find the common things that you can work with, you know, regardless of the divergency in terms of what you believe. Find those common human things that pull people together. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And so you approach other faith groups with an open mind and with an interest. I mean, you're going to be who you are, they're going to be who they are. Find the common ground, those things that affect everybody.
Well, the common ground is humanity,
exactly.
And we're all children of a God that we perhaps see differently, but we recognize a divine element when we're talking in a faith community, at least.
Yes.
Yeah, no, this is very profitable for us to do this.
Here lies the foundation of basic human rights. You know, how I interpret that through the lens of my experience and yours may be a little different. And you mentioned India. Having lived there, yes, I did see that happening. And then it became politicized. The Hindus, and on the one hand, and you have other religions, not much different from what we have in the West. You know, in the Western part of the world.
You mean the friction between them?
The friction. I lived in Britain
during
the time when the Irish Republic Army, and you know the IRA and the bombings and everything like that. It was politically motivated, but it was a time when the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestants, you know, from centuries back, had their differences, and I clearly remember.
Very violent time. Remember,
it was extremely violent.
The horse guards were bombed on their way back from Buckingham Palace.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was living in London at the time when the bombings were going on. People were afraid. The conflict began to escalate. And I can recall going into train stations and worrying about, you know, what would happen next. You look at a trash can and you think there could be something in it. It was a very unsettling time, because religious divides and issues that had not been resolved, you know, created this very unsettling, unsafe atmosphere. And it's not something I would want to go back to.
One of the special rewards of working with public affairs and religious liberty for me has been meeting some of these public officials And one that I'll never forget was actually before I was working with Liberty Magazine. I was working with the Drug Education Journal for our church, and I met at my request with a certain general who had been one of the top generals in the first Iraq War. I won't name him, but he was very well known. And we spoke for a long time. I shared my faith. To me, it's unavoidable, necessary when you're meeting with these people. And we talked about it, and he said he owed his life to a Seventh-day Adventist corpsman who had saved his life in Vietnam. And then after explaining that, he had to go half an hour after the allotted time. And I'll never forget him walking down the hall, calling out to me several times, "We believe what you are doing. We believe what you are doing. Keep doing it." That is the reward that we often get. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.